So now we're going to show you how to install the Visual KPI Server, and Michael Saucier is here to explain what machine he's on and the steps involved in checking the prerequisites and making sure you're ready to go for installation. Michael?
Okay, hi Robert. So yeah, we're looking at a Windows 2012 R2 server. It's running in Azure. Doesn't matter where it runs. It can be any VM anywhere as long as it meets the requirements. This one in particular has 2 CPUs and 7 gigs of RAM, so pretty small and cheap machine here that we're going to do it on today. We're going to run through a couple of all of the prerequisites necessary to make the Server Manager and the Visual KPI Server run on this machine. So step 1 is to make sure that the correct roles are installed, and you open the Windows Server Manager for that. Manage, add roles and features, and click through the steps here. Pick the right server. Yep, we're on the one that's local. And here, we're going to go through the server roles. There's only one that we have to select, and that's the web server role. The other one here is selected by default by Windows. We didn't check that box. And in the web server, there's just a handful of things that need to be selected. The default things that are selected you can leave alone. You don't have to unselect anything that comes by default when IIS is installed. What we're going to do though by election here is to add dynamic content compression. That's always a good idea. We're going to add basic authentication and Windows authentication. And most importantly, we're going to add the .NET extensibility and the ASP.NET 4.5. You can see that I've made these selections already on this machine, and that's it. The rest of the checkboxes that you see are auto-selected by Windows when we make the selections that are required by Visual KPI. Under Management Tools, we just need the one thing, the Management Console, and that's a default selection as well when we pick the role. So we've made no changes, and therefore don't need to finish this wizard. Robert, do you think it's instructive to go back and run that wizard with all those things unselected, and just watch them paint dry for a few minutes? Okay.
No, I think it's totally fine. And let's go check on, I guess, the .NET Framework.
Yeah, so that's going to be, it depends on the version of the operating system that you are running. If it's 2012, you don't have to check because it's already late enough. But if it's 2008 R2, then it needs to be at least .NET 4.5.2. And there's a couple ways you can go check that. In the control panel, under Programs, there's going to be a line item for the .NET Framework. And so you can see in here that this has already got 4.5.2 stuff in it. But if you see a Microsoft .NET Framework 4, or you see 4.5, or you see 4.5.1 in here, then you'll need to update to 4.5.2. That's a simple download from Microsoft. And there's actually another way, Robert, if it's instructive, to absolutely verify the version that you have running.
I don't think it's necessary, Michael, and I think but I think it is helpful to clarify that it's 4.5.2 or newer.
Or newer, right? So 4.6, 4.6.1, all of those work. Everything since 4.5.2 will be fine.
Perfect.
All right, the next thing we want to do is make sure that we have access to SQL Server somewhere on the network or locally. And that, just be clear, we don't require that SQL be installed locally, but we do require that the SQL Management Studio client tools are installed locally on the web server. So that is so that we can make any necessary changes or check any problems that exist if there are permission issues with getting to SQL. And by getting to SQL, I mean we, Visual KPI Server, need to read and write the Visual KPI database on a regular basis. And at the very, very beginning here, when we're doing the installation, the logged in user doing the install has got to have certain privileges on SQL Server. So it's important to check those privileges before you start the installation. And those privileges are, in summary, at least security admin on SQL Server or better, so that the install will run without error.
It's also important to understand that the SQL Server that we're talking about here during the installation is the SQL Server instance that is used inside of Visual KPI for all of its configuration information. This is not necessarily connecting to SQL as a data source at runtime in the future. This is the one we need just to operate Visual KPI properly.
Exactly, and I think the interface type of SQL connection will be dealt with in a different video.
That's correct.
Okay, so let's just open the SQL Management Studio tools and look for, you'll probably have, if it's a network-based shared instance of SQL, it'll be a full SQL. If it's a local SQL Express, it'll look something like this. You may have one or more databases already in existence, but just to go in here and look to make sure that your login has sufficient rights. So in this particular case, I'm logged in as me, and I can look at my server roles here, and I see that I'm sysadmin. So if I was security admin or better, meaning security admin, server admin, setup admin, or sysadmin, then I would be able to do this installation.
And Michael, is it true that you need those roles for installation, but in the future you may not need those roles? You could be reduced in your roles later, or is it something you need to have ongoing if you're going to be administering Visual KPI in the future?
So administering it from a runtime perspective does not require this. That means administering it from the Visual KPI designer. However, doing an upgrade will require the security admin or better role in SQL. So if we're going to move from a version X to version X plus 1, the person doing that, the logged in user, or at least the person logged in and connected to SQL using this Management Studio tool, needs to have security admin or better rights. And that's just for the purposes of changing the database during a migration or an upgrade. It's not required for normal operations, and the normal admin of the Visual KPI server doesn't even need to open SQL ever.
Perfect.
So we've got sufficient role responsibilities there. That's okay. If we don't have them, you can do a test. You can say, hey, if I can make a new database and call it test, if I can make it and then I can delete it, 99% chance I have enough responsibility, enough role responsibility here that I can, or rights that I can execute the task. There's only one thing that's not tested by this procedure, and that is the execute procedures, execute permissions on stored procedures. So that's a little bit of an edge there. So I think that just doing this test, if I can create just 10 out of 10 or 9 times out of 100, it's going to be okay.
Perfect.
But really, the definitive answer is you got to have security admin rights or better.
Great. So it looks like you've gone through all of those prerequisites, which is, again, the .NET 4.5.2 or newer. The Server Manager roles were all checked. So that's in the Windows Server Manager. You've confirmed you have SQL either local or on the network, in this case local. You've confirmed you have the Management Studio, which is a client tools. And you confirmed you have the rights to do what you need to do, which is security admin or better. In your case, you were sysadmin, which is the most rights you can have. Perfect. Okay, so I think the next thing that we would do is download Visual KPI from our website, and in this case, we've already done that.
There's one more thing, Robert, and that is to check that the correct .NET Framework is enabled in IIS. So you can run the IIS management tool here and look at the top level at something called the ISAPI and CGI restrictions. Now in here, the .NET frameworks are constrained. You can have, in some cases, .NET 4, .NET 2, .NET 1.1 even, and they're going to have separate rights and responsibilities here in the server. So we've got to allow this to run, and we're going to allow both the 64 and 32-bit versions to run. And this would be the last real kind of step.
Perfect.
Prior to installation.
Excellent.
Okay, so now we've downloaded the software. We're back from the commercial break, and here it is. It's downloaded and ready to go. On this machine, we don't have any client-type tools like Excel or anything that we need to run the designer, so we're just going to install the Server Manager. So that is pretty straightforward. Run as admin, elevate prompt. And now we've got a couple of decisions to make. Number one, where do we want to install the software? By default, on the same drive that you're running the executable from. You can put it anywhere. So many clients choose to have their apps run on a dedicated drive, not the OS drive. In this case, this is a single drive machine, so we're going to take the defaults. Pretty snappy even on a slow machine, I think, so we'll be done here in a minute.
Great. You can sing us a little tune, maybe?
I'll do shadow puppets, so please follow along at home on the included URL. Here, click at the bottom, like on YouTube.
Perfect.
All right, so that's installed the Server Manager, but it has not installed Visual KPI as a website. This simply installed the tool which we use to create websites. So now if you have multiple websites here, it means that in IIS you have several websites. You can choose any of them to install us on, or you can choose to install Visual KPI on its own dedicated website by clicking on the top level. So by doing Sites, right-click, Install New Instance, that will create a new website. And then by doing something like click one of the existing websites, right-click, Install New Instance, that installs an instance of Visual KPI on this website. So IIS supports many simultaneous parallel and unrelated websites, and on that, on a single website, you can have many instances of our software. And on a single IIS box, you can have really thousands of instances of Visual KPI running. So
and in the case of Visual KPI, I think it's important to know that an instance of our software is equivalent to a Visual KPI website.
That's right. That's right. So we will be creating a website that is a specific URL, and that's the way you'll get to this instance. So steps are right-click, install new instance, agree to the egregious and unenforceable shrink wrap license, put in a key. So here's something that you'll get from Robert when the installation is about to happen. He's going to send it to you by email, or the license manager system will send it to you by email. We just take that, copy it, put it right here. That little green check mark means it's a valid key. So when you're doing the install, you want to make sure that the license key contents match what you think you're doing with that customer. Here's where we see that we're using the default website. Now, if we had selected the top level to install on, we'd have a white box here, and we could name the website. We name it whatever we want and choose the port. Right now we're using an existing website and installing an instance under it, so it inherits the name of the default website, which doesn't appear anywhere in our software, but it appears in IIS. We inherit the port, and then we can name the instance and select the regional settings for this particular install of Visual KPI. Just take the defaults. Again, we can decide where to deploy the runtime bits for the website. The default is just fine, but you can put it on any drive the customer wants. Now we have to pick a database server. So this is where you would connect to that remote SQL on another box, or use the local one that we're going to use.
And if you remember, this is for the database that Visual KPI is going to use for all of its configuration information, not a data source for your data.
So now if the person doing the install doesn't have the proper SQL login mapped to their Windows identity, you can use a dedicated SQL identity in order to do the configuration. So this is another option for authentication when you need elevated privileges in SQL, but maybe the person running this install doesn't have it. They might have a temporary IT-provided higher-level SQL login, but we really prefer to use Windows whenever possible. Click Next.
Go for it.
Now we'll go through the steps of creating the database. After it asks us for our name and our email. The phone number is optional, and this is used for sending alerts to the system administrator when the website requires attention. It uses the same alerting mechanism that KPI alerts later will use, but this is for system-level messages, and it only goes to one or a handful of people. You can have more people by separating their names by semicolon, or you can come back later and make a contact group with multiple people in it and use that.
Great.
Install sample data, yes or no. So if we know, if it's a known customer and they know the software and they don't need sample data, you don't need sample data, but we're going to put it in. It's a handful of fake KPIs. And I had some ideas about how to make this really super better here in the next couple of builds, Robert, so we should talk about that.
You bet.
Go through copying the files to the file system and then running SQL scripts one at a time that create this instance of the Visual KPI database with blank contents, but all the necessary tables, views, store procedures, and grants that are needed in order to run the product. So there we've got a successful install. The product is installed with both the alert server and the cache server running. If you haven't configured the alert server yet, and you won't have configured it when you just install for the first time, you can stop this service until you get around to configuring the alert server. So now there's a bunch of stuff here that is the next step, but the most important thing is to verify that you've got a working website by right-clicking on the name and clicking Browse.
And so Michael's just gone through the entire installation, again, checking all the prerequisites, making sure the server met the right requirements, downloading Visual KPI, installing the Server Manager, then creating an instance of Visual KPI and naming it and telling it, matching it with the database that it's where it's going to store its configuration. And then all of that underlying stuff was put in place, the SQL database was created, all the settings were put in place, etc., and even the sample data installed, and now Michael's been able to pull up a working site here with some fake sample data in it. And now in a real installation, you'd be ready to either go configure more KPIs or set up some interfaces to your data sources, whether those are historians or databases or web services or whatever, any number of 1,000 things you want to connect to, and then you're off to the races. So here, just in a few minutes, we're able to start from scratch and get a fully running Visual KPI system up. Michael, anything else you think's worth showing?
Let's see. I guess if people are interested in the details of what got deployed, it might be interesting to see what's actually on disk and in memory. So we can go look on this PC, and this is optional. You don't have to go look for this stuff, but you want to know where things go. The default place for things is program files Transpara and Visual KPI v5. This is where the server manager bits are, and this is where all the default things that you can do with our software live. Before you deploy them to an individual site, all the basis, the models for everything all live here. That's on the disk. And then up here is the website. So this one is named Visual KPI, and here are the bits that are then run by IIS, because we're an in-memory application on IIS, and so this is where the bits live for that. And then finally, the database that holds all the configuration information, just refresh that, and there's the Visual KPI database with all the tables, views, and store procedures.
Perfect. So I think we'll close up for this installation. Things you might do after this besides configuring your system and hooking it up to your data are talk about security for your users, the domain name or FQDN that you might use to give access, whether you want to give access outside of your network to users and how to secure those things. So a lot more advanced topics to go through, but that's a simple installation of the Visual KPI server. Thank you, Michael.
You bet.